Доброго дня, шановні глядачі.
Good afternoon, dear viewers. We're continuing our series of webinars jointly conducted by the Human Rights Platform and the Project to Support Inclusive, Fair and Honest Election Practices of the Council of Europe in Ukraine. This is the 7th webinar in this series. The previous ones were about some very important subjects such as the main stages of the election process, the role, the function, and the tasks of the election commissions. We talked about campaigning, talked about who we can elect, who will nominate, whom, and other important things. Today we have another important subject dealing with money. We have formulated the name like that. Where does the money for the local election come from and how one should report it? Today we're going to have two experts, Volodymyr Venger, Doctor of Law, Professor of the Department of Law and Public Law of Kyiv-Mohyla Academy, and Natalia Vadimova, Deputy Head of the Secretariat of the Central Election Commission. Good afternoon. Traditionally, I would call upon our audience to be active and to ask questions in the comments, under the stream, or under our broadcast, and we would be able to quickly answer your questions during our discussion, and perhaps you would be able to focus on some important issues in our today's discussion. So, Volodymyr, perhaps you can start. That's an important subject really related to the money. Where does the money come from? Thank you, Alexander. As a matter of fact, the issue of financing the elections is relatively simple on the one hand. On the other hand, it's very complicated and very comprehensive because it means that a number of very important organization events should be carried out, not only by the government agents or by the local governments, but it also means that quite serious activities should be carried out by private persons, both legal ones and private ones. Primarily we're talking about candidates and local political party organizations. According to the law, all the system of funding local elections consists of formally three main blocks of funds, which under certain conditions can be redistributed, or in certain situations when they can be combined. So talking about the essence of those blocks, the main one is funding from the public budget, which means that the funds go to the Central Election Commission as well as to carry out those authorities that are implemented by the CEC, not only as part of the process, but also before the beginning of this process. That's a huge number of different activities, and here we have to stress that at the local election, the Central Election Commission does not directly participate in the registration of candidates or in some other steps that affect the election process. However, it has a lot of other competencies before the election and during the election process. One of the recent novelties, is, for example, where the development of the territorial election commissions is outside of the election process now. And during the election process, the CEC provides organizational, methodological support, and unfortunately, it also has to respond quickly, including to the legal gaps and even the deficiencies in the election code, and all those competences of the CEC can be called management and administration of the elections and referenda. However, in this case, we're talking about the local elections. Well, Volodymyr, as far as I remember, those the bulletins, for example, the ballots are going to be published with the money coming from the public budget, right? Well, that's the second block of funds that I want to talk about. The thing is that the other important block is the money of the local budgets. That's their nature. On the one hand, but by its essence, this is the money that they receive from the central public budget as a targeted subvention. And in fact, this money goes directly into the organization of the election. This is spent by the Territorial Election Commission. Look, this is still money coming from the public budget, right? Well, it just comes to the regions on those targeted subventions, but as far as I understand, it can be found in the central public budget. Well, when I talked about three blocks, we can break them down further on, as well as the money that goes into the Central Election Commission. We can try to talk separately about the National Register voters, or we can combine it. I wouldn't want to go into all of those details, but the second block is really the national public budget that goes into the local budgets and then is delivered to the election commissions. And several slides later, we will talk about whether it is correct at all to finance it only, to finance the election only with the national budget. But that's the next step. So in the second block, we're talking about the local budgets, that the central budget that sent the money to the local budget to be further on used. And in terms of having such large-scale organizational activities as elections, this is the money of the election funds of the organizations and parties that have nominated their candidates. And here we have several important elements. First of all, we're talking about the election fund money, not the party funds, and we have to differentiate it. Another important thing, we're talking about the funds owned by the local party organizations, not by the parties in general. Going ahead, if we speak about the main objective of the use of those funds, namely to fund campaigning, here again we have to distinguish between the party as an association of people that is working on the national level and the local organizations that have nominated the candidates, the ones that have not nominated them. We already see in Kyiv and all over the country political advertising, and in the previous webinars I'm sure you have discussed it in details. Well, I hope we will discuss it today as well, because I think that this is confusing for everyone, including for the participants of the election races, because those subjects are autonomous in a certain way. Everyone can have election funds. Who should finance what? For example, you've said that the central party organization is not a subject in this election campaign, but it can replenish those election funds. Right, but it would still be the money that is to be spent by the local organizations. Right. In case they nominate candidates. Yes, after they nominate at least one candidate at a conference. In fact, we have another global issue at this webinar, which is related to the main fund models of the formation of the election funds and how they function. Here, however, I want to focus on the fact that this is the money which is mostly not public, which with a very serious public oversight, though. So the nature of these funds is the proper own funds of the parties, because I would even approach this in a broad way, because the parties that get the contributions of physical persons into the election funds, still these are the contributions that are provided to the parties. And here we have problems with anti-corruption laws, but we will arrive there. To characterize it in general, those three blocks are the money where there is a lot of public interest in that, and that explains why the procedure of getting this money is so strict and formalized. and how this money is administered, managed, and reported. And this is true about all the three blocks, because at all the three stages, these processes are quite complicated, sometimes because of the budget law, if we're talking about the first block. Sometimes it is explained by the election laws and the party regulations. Now, talking about the first two blocks, this, in fact, is the discussion that I have already mentioned, whether the government should fund the elections at all, and whether the money should come from the national state budget with the current model that we have. Natalia may correct me, but when the law on the local election was approved in 2015, the wording about how the elections should be funded by the public budget was slightly different. And we had the biggest discussion about how the mayors can be, or the elders of the villages, whether their elections should be funded by the public budget. In this election campaign, the situation is somewhat worse, but as the parliament adopted the current law, they rejected the idea of electing the elders at all. Now, these elders are in fact the persons that are elected or appointed, you mean as heads of the district and regional constituencies? No, they're going to be appointed by a council. They would have the public officials of the local self-governments working in certain constituencies. Now, to rationalize the use of public funds and to simplify this work, there is some rationale in it. However, this is what I already said. At the previous election campaign, we had a very hot discussion as to whether the public budget should finance at all the election of the local elders, because the law suggested that they should be funded by the local budgets. But the newly established territorial communities, they wanted to elect their elders. They were infuriated. Now, this is less relevant for this election campaign, but it shows you the nature of the elections and its funding. Today, the election code says that what is funded by the central level are regular elections, additional elections, early elections, and the first election campaigns. Now, this is the regular campaign and the first election campaign. The law suggests that these two types of elections should be funded with the money coming from the national budget, as with a targeted subvention. But using the example of the elders and the initiatives of the communities, on the parliamentary level, there was once an idea about why the local elections cannot be funded by the local budgets. Many people tried to explain it, to justify it with the fact that the local elections are a local initiative. That's the need of the local community. They are the ones that are most interested. But the counter-argument was that it's all of the country that is interested in having the fair election and effective local government. And probably we have to take into account the realistic factor that not all the communities are self-sufficient and could afford funding elections. This discussion may be quite important in the future because the decentralization seems to be over. So now the local communities should get additional funds. Should. Unfortunately, this is not very good either in legal science nor political science nor history, but we have to say they should get this money because unfortunately the communities have been reformatted 2 months ago only. Well, right, I'm saying this would be relevant for the next local election. Maybe, but still it will have to be analyzed very seriously. Now when the Central Election Commission has counted the rough amount of money, now it was very difficult to do even this rough calculation. And if calculated with the count of all the types of elections and all the territorial administrative units and overlay it with the community capacities, that's extremely difficult. And if we want to think about all these and do all these things at least a year before the election, that's a lot of logistics, and that's a risk for having the election campaigns. And here perhaps we should talk about some potential reserve fund, well, in inverted commas, or other possibilities for the CEC to have some reserves. But I don't think we would be ready for such a transition in the nearest future, because in addition to just financial and organizational aspects, there are some political aspects as well of the local and of the central national level. Tell us about the experience, if you're aware of that, of the experience of other countries, whether there are such situations when the local election or maybe even the national election is not funded by the central public budget. Well, it all depends on the type of election we're talking about and the format of it. What is it we're financing? Talking about organization of the election campaigns in general, well, it's hard for me. I have not analyzed the situation separately, but if we break down into different elements of the elections, we will see the publishing of the ballots, providing premises for the polling stations, communications, stationery for the commission members, the pay of the election commission members. So different countries, especially the federal countries, very often give the task to the local self-governments, the local executive authorities, to at least partially fund the elections. Those countries where the administration bodies for the election process are not temporary, but work as part of the executive or judiciary, or with engagement of different other. So it can really be different. It depends. In those countries, for example, the pay to the election administrators, is not there. There can be just supplements. It can be additional pay that these people receive for additional working hours, but that don't have a separate line. With us, the pay level of the Territorial Election Commission members is very high, is a very large share of all the funds, about 80%. That's really the salary fund. You mean of all the election costs? Well, if we look at it from the point of view of the overall amount, that's a lot of money. And if we look at the structure, it's true that the share of the salary fund is very high. But if we look at it from the point of view of other indicators that can be used here, for example, the number of the members of the TEC and of the PEC, per capita, this is not so much money per one member of the commission. And if we look at all of the money that goes into the salary fund, then it would not be very much money. Well, this is an old discussion, and quite often there were discussions about who should be paying that at all. For many years, the discussions have focused on the practice where the members of the election commissions get additional money from the subjects of the election race. Now it would entangle criminal liability for that, according to the latest recent changes. And it's a separate discussion that we should perhaps have, whether those members should be permanent or not permanent, whether they should have this kind of working loads, because the objectives are political ones, right? And except for the Central Election Commission, these are not civil servants, but these are temporarily contracted people who come to work. Well, let me just say one thing. These are the people that are working on the basis of civil contracts. So this is not a part of any labor relations. Very often there are questions. For example, there are people who say that these people are hired for a certain period of time. No, they just provide certain services. They do a certain amount of work, and according to the legal framework and the election code of Ukraine and the labor remuneration conditions, etc. But as regards the remuneration, I think that here we should take into account the following. In fact, these people get a lot of competences, a lot of tasks and functions, and of course the pay for their work should be quite decent. At the same time, if we look at the election law, we would see that a certain category of people, they have the right to perform the competences of the commission member as paid work, and all the other people, including these people, they would get their pay, on the day when the vote tabulate, or for the day when they work the voting day and the tabulation day. Now, as regards these people, they provide a lot of services to the commissions, but the pay that they get is on the minimum level. If we look at funding of the work of the commission members, or we have other engaged people, by the subjects who participate in the development, formation of the election commission, well, first of all, we should provide fair possibilities in terms of the pay levels, not even possibilities, but the fact that their labor remuneration should be equal, because if some political forces can pay more, for example, then other political forces may not agree, for example, to having certain subjects and certain persons to be included as members of certain election commissions. Well, that's an issue for competition. It's a free market. It's a matter of principle. Why I'm asking this question, and I would really like to hear your opinion. Very often the law in Ukraine is separate from our real life, and it usually suggests the models that do not comply with the real life. What I'm talking about is, it's not a secret, we've seen that in many analytical reports of the NGOs that do election observation, that one of our problems is that the election commission members can be bought by some subjects from others, and thus forming majority, that this is a kind of a gray market, where a subject that brings that person into a commission would substitute this person. Sometimes we would have rotation of the members, sometimes more than 2 times. And in that situation, when those competing subjects are paying a gray money in order to get a certain influence upon a commission, what's the point to use public money in large amounts to pay the members of the election commission? That's what I was.
Let me add that CSC receives requests from different persons claiming that they didn't receive pay from some political parties, etc. That's much more complex, in fact, and it's based or is related to principles under the Council of Europe standards. That's the Code of Best Governance. The administrative authority should be independent and impartial. So whatever formal relations exist, whether that's pay or any other form of or type of relations between the members of the commission and the subjects, well, it's not appointment, but it's just submitting the nominees from the parties. So all that is a violation of the principle of objectivity. Another important element here is that the subject that submits the nominee to a commission shouldn't have any leverages of influence, and the legislation does not provide for any leverages of influence of the local party organization over the member of the commission. At one of the stages of the electoral legislation development prior to 2010, Ukraine attempted, and it was an attempt to develop the tool of recalling members of the commission, but the experts insisted that this procedure should be eliminated, and what they can do now is just replace persons. Basically, that's the same when it comes to the substance, almost, but under international standards, this type of remuneration would be contrary to impartiality and objectivity of the management body. There are two options. One, increase the funding from the public budget, and I agree with Natalia here. So the number looks impressive, but it just looks impressive. Could you illustrate that somehow? That's a little bit more than 2 billion hryvnia. But in fact, this number is higher because we are talking about the subsidies that are going to be used by territorial commissions. This number does not include a number of other additional costs related to the CSC work and the administering authorities of the voters register and other authorities that should provide for the work of the PCs and TCs, the local police who is to take care of the ballots, etc. So and a lot of other things. So that's the number that is there, but it is much higher. Well, anyways, when it comes to the public budget, it was very difficult to secure this number there for the CSC. And it was only thanks to the amendments to the budget, and it was in July this year, they managed to sort of secure the number, well, the money that is more or less appropriate. But if you compare 2 billion with the scale of the elections, and we have almost 30 of PSCs and lots of TSCs that have lots of different powers to exercise. And if you look at the remuneration of those people who work there, so the numbers are really tiny. So one way is to increase this number and pay more to people, and that's going to be fair, and it's going to be expensive. Another option here is try and establish the core of the election commission. Then we need to change the model of managing the elections, and maybe we have to switch from the ECs to administration authorities, so that the central authorities and other levels would work on permanent or non-permanent basis. In some countries, for instance, they delegate representatives of different authorities. For instance, representative of a local executive authority that provides for logistics, representative from the national police, let's say, that is to provide public order and security. The judge is delegated, that is in charge of appeals, and administrator from local authorities. So that's the core. And party representatives got engaged as the observers, permanently functioning, so to say. This model contains better guarantees of the independence of the commissions on the parties. It's hard for me to imagine that the party that just nominates or delegates its representative to work in a commission is not in touch with this person and does not influence the person. The model I described looks very attractive given international standards and costs. There is one disadvantage, though, and that's the deficiency that doesn't allow for the parliament to approve that, since we've been discussing this model for 20 years or so. The deficiency is administrative resource. Everybody is concerned that engaging persons, representatives of executive authorities, judges, and local governments representatives will lead to the concentration of power in some election bodies. So people will be aware that they are going to be in charge of this or the other issue, and this type of control exercised by them will secure to some parties, if not a victory at the elections, at least that would secure to some unlawful advantages. And that's a reality of Ukraine. So we lack trust to different institutions in our country. So, well, that's the reality of our life. So um, uh, we are kind of balancing around this number, using the arguments that served as the basis for coming up with this particular number. A lot of parties pay bonuses to members of the commission, which is kind of a bribe. And to combat that, we can introduce criminal liability for this type of acts. But from my perspective, introducing liability, any liability, and even a reversibility of punishment, this wouldn't resolve the issue, because liability is not going to result to automatic honesty or fairness of elections. People just wouldn't agree to work in the commissions. At the moment, local elections are going to be conducted on the basis that members of the commission, if they receive some authorized bonuses, then they can face criminal liability. Well, criminal liability has been introduced by law, but along with that, there is a need to hold elections, and people working in TSCs should cope with huge amount of work. PSCs will come up to the forefront later, and they will be actively working for a week. But well, it is the DCs, TCs that are going to work really hard from the moment they receive ballots. Well, territorial commissions, given the new documents, given the new procedures of calculating, given the number of mandates, are facing huge challenges. And very often people cannot figure out what to do. Actually, the interim option is to increase the number and pay good money for the people to be encouraged to work. Would you like to add? Yes. Indeed, people, members of the commission, cope with colossal type of work. Well, I am dealing with financial issues. That's part of my responsibility. I can tell that members of the commission should be professionals in specific areas. So, in accounting, in procurement, in reporting, in banking, how to open accounts, etc. And it's very difficult to find people with respective skills who would work on the commissions, people with experience, knowledge, and very often in the course of the election campaign there are a lot of violations when it comes to logistics and other things. Given the reality of Ukraine, given the procedures for the upcoming local elections, TSCs are to conduct public procurement as per the law on public procurement. And we know that there are established procedures under the law that require appointing designated persons, approving the document on designated authorities. We have to follow the procedure to properly identify the items to be procured, etc. And whatever issue we talk about, there is a liability for the violation. And persons who agree to work on the commission at a later stage, when they identify what kind of work they have to deal with and the scope of this work, might refuse to work on the commission later, because it's a very difficult thing and a difficult job. When it comes to procurement, for instance, or whatever information it is, it should be done via Prozoro system. And TSC, just to organize the work of the commissions, developed the guidance. It is available on the website of the CSC. to assist members of the TSC in conducting public procurement. In this guidance, we provide a very detailed information and concise information on all the steps to be undertaken by TSC to follow the public procurement procedure as established by law. On procurement, I know there was a long discussion on that. When it comes to TEC, well, should we follow the standard procurement procedure if it is procurement that is one-off, so to say? Well, okay, so we know that some accounts should be opened at the Treasury, but there are some other things that are not kind of directly linked to all this one-off, let's say, type of procurements. Time frame is kind of, hard to comply with. So from your perspective, all these special procurement procedures, should they all be applicable when it comes to election process? The CC suggested amending the procedure of identifying the subject of procurement, and we can group the items based on the types of the commission, constituents, etc. This allows for TSCs to enter into a certain number of contracts, and if the value is less than 50,000 hryvnia, then they follow other established procedure. Again, the TSC is to be really careful here. For instance, if it comes to procurement ballots, and that's oblast, then it means that they have to enter into 100 contracts or so. That's only about ballots. Naturally, these contracts are going to be published at the Prozoro platform, and we can carefully look at these contracts, etc., who produced them, etc. But on the other hand, we complicate the procedure so much, and that basically results in the deadlock for the TSCs, and very often they don't know what to do. Though sometimes the option could be easier, for instance, to make public all the information and be transparent, but simplify the procedures. For instance, when it comes to open tenders, etc., when it comes to the timeline, it's absolutely unrealistic to follow the procedure completely. On the other hand, you need to take into account the time that is left for the, or should be left for the production of the items. For instance, a new provision in the law is that the information companion materials should be produced by the subject of the electoral process. So when it comes to local elections, so the printed materials are really produced in large amounts. So we need to take into account the capacity of the production companies and their ability to produce them within the established time frame. We looked at this in terms of the posters, leaflets, and other things. So the time to produce this type of items is really limited. So that means that elections can be disrupted, then the quality could be undermined, and then it means that PSCs may not be provided with the printed materials within the established time frame. Volodymyr has participated in our webinars before, and we kept talking about the necessity to going back to the analysis of the electoral legislation after these elections and see what could be amended to improve it. Ballots, are they without protection, who can produce them, who can print them? Well, local companies, and the level of protection is established by the TEC, but we are not talking about the level of protection that is provided by the CC. When it comes to printing ballots for the national elections, the law was amended to provide that this type of items are not covered by the electoral laws because there are only two companies that can print ballots, and there is no competition here. On the other hand, if you look at the level of protection at the local elections, it's hard to find the publishing company that can produce ballots with the required level of protection. And it's a lot of ballots. We know that the elections are held all over Ukraine at all levels, and it's really a lot of ballots that should be produced within a very, very short period of time. Volodymyr, as to requirements of public procurement, a few words about public procurement. Indeed, to find the solution is not so difficult. The solution is apparent. That's to relieve the TCs from the burden they have now. When it comes to regular local elections, we can plan in advance, and this procurement should be done under simplified procedures. But if it is not a CSC, but at least the rep offices of the CSCs that can conduct this procurement, or other authorities that would work on permanent basis. Maybe that's the authorities that administer the register, or some other institutions that are subjects of authorities, but they exist outside the electoral process and have necessary professional skills. That's the matter of trust that should be taken care of here, but we can calculate in advance what kind of stationery is needed or how many ballots might be needed, and then we can start negotiating production earlier in advance. So that's a lot of technical work. When it comes to local elections, publishing companies that are capable to produce this number of ballots within the time specified to meet the requirements is really limited. Usually that's the same companies that do that. So this type of work can be delegated to permanently functioning institutions. I wouldn't call them bodies, though in the future there's going to be bodies or rep offices. But I think that's one of the options to resolve the issues.
The Election Commission in the future should just have to deal with the election process as such rather than material support to it. Let me add quickly as regards to territorial and regional offices. On our initiative in particular, if they are established, they will perform the functions of the secretariats of the territorial district commissions, because the same problem is there not only at the local election campaigns, but at the national, presidential, parliamentary elections, where we face the lack of professionalism of the commission members, and as a result, that means that the money is not used effectively, that they cannot use proper procurement work, that they cannot provide proper funds to the election campaigns. Why just at the national level? Well, the thing is that as regards the local elections, the territorial and regional offices, they would also have certain functions. However, as the plan is to set up those territorial plans on the regional levels and the city of Kyiv, but as regards the territorial ones, they should be established with the register administration offices that will no longer exist. So the idea is to set up the territorial election commissions on the district level, So perhaps they will perform certain functions, provide oversight, but completely in view of the number of territorial election commissions, it would not be realistic for them to perform the functions of the Secretariat. Well, that's about my next slide as to who administers the money. At the national elections, the CEC has lots of levers, at least regarding the budgets or introducing corrections to the budgets for the commissions. At the local election, the election code makes the main subject for the use of the money the territorial election commissions, the TECs. At the same time, the CEC, in August of this year, adopted its main amounts for the costs to be spent by the TECs. And within those standards, these TECs can go on as regards their budgets. And although the money is not very high, in fact quite low for those commissions, but unfortunately quite often the heads of the commissions and the manager of the commission, they still try to abuse it. And it is not always that the law enforcement agencies can monitor that. It's not always that the CEC can see that. So we have already spoken about how to make this aspect of the election organization more professional by either handing them over to some territorial authorities or to somebody else would take care of a lot of potential issues and eventually would allow us to provide proper material and technical support to the elections. Now, I suggest that we move to the private block and talk about the election funds. Several aspects of how the funds function. The first and the most important thing is what kinds of election funds there are. Now, especially journalists often speak about election accounts or account of a candidate, account of an election. We are not talking about accounts. Yes, there are accounts there as well. We will talk about them, but here we're talking about the funds, and their legal nature is very specific. These are temporary structures or funds, the objective of which is just to make sure that the candidates spend the money to participate in the election campaign. And the peculiarity of the local elections is that such election funds should be set up for every kind of elections. Today I received a call from a would-be participant of the election process who works with one of the local organizations of political parties, and she said that in fact in our region we're planning to nominate our candidates for 130 elections. And she asked me, can we do that with just one election fund? No. Oh, well, she was kidding, in fact. Let me tell you at once. And she said, do I need to have 130 funds? And I said, unfortunately, you would have to have more than that, maybe about 200 funds, because where you are electing members of the council and the mayor, these would be different funds. And for that lady, it was not any news. She was kidding, as I say, but for many people, even today, they can't keep it in their heads, the scale of this campaign. Because the parties should have their own election funds that nominate the candidate list. We're talking about the proportional element of it. And the proportional election system means that these are elections to the regional councils, district councils, more than 10,000 types of elections. So the organization of a party that has nominated its candidates, where the party would have to have its own election fund. Separately, candidate councillors, we're talking about majoritarian constituencies, and candidate mayors, the so-called single mandate majoritarian system. So practically all of those main levels where the election funds would have to be launched, they in fact create a whole multitude of funds. And now we will proceed to the understanding of the accounts. So according to the proportional system, they should even have two types of accounts, the accumulator and the current one, while according to the majority... No, let's get back to the funds. I have a couple of questions here, because we have discussed it at the previous webinars. While nominating, for example, a or a regional party organization can nominate all the candidates in all the levels. And in fact, this can rescue the participants, because in many situations, party organizations are quite weak. They don't have district organizations, for example. However, if a regional organization nominates all the candidates of every level in an oblast, it will not be able to spend this money to support their campaigns, from their regional fund. They can only pay for the regional candidates. No. There should be a reservation to be made at once. An election fund is not an election fund that is owned by the local party organization. It has a different nature. It is characteristic of the election list nominated by the local party organization. We'll talk about the administrators later. If we have an election fund for the election to the local council, it does not affect the election to the district council in the same region, or election of a mayor of a city, regional city in that region. So the local organization at the nomination stage will generate a new subject, an autonomous one, that needs its certain cost. And this organization would only relate to it in one respect. Now I'm showing it to you only so we can talk about different models. It will only be related to it in terms of appointing the administrator, and perhaps in terms of getting the money there, and once the election is over, getting the money back to its account. However, when the administrator is appointed, the election fund, and if there are two of them, the accumulative one and the current ones, and when we talk about a candidate election fund, they don't have current accounts, they would become completely autonomous. And the administrator, they can use the money any way they want. Well, as far as I remember, the law on the election, local election of 2015, in fact said that the ones who nominate can pay for the campaigning of those subjects. Well, practically nothing has changed there, because a local organization of a political party, if it nominates a list or a candidate, in that case, it can participate in funding and forming the election fund of a local party organization or of a candidate. Dealing with the other elements of the election fund, there are no changes since 2015. Just like it is today, just like it was 2015, the law on the local election or the election code have not been brought in line with the law on political parties, which says that there can be other sources for developing the funds, such as physical persons' contributions. With the recent amendments to the election code, they have changed the number of subjects that do not have the right to participate in development of the legal fund. These are legal persons. While at the other parts, the things that are related to transferring the money from the subjects who do not have the right to contribute to the election fund, there is only the provision on the physical persons. For some reason they have forgotten the legal persons. Well, there are many things that with which the law can still be changed, right? This is a question from the audience. But I also wanted to ask it. It's a question from Kirilo Vladzo. The question about the first group. It's the organization of the parties that nominate their candidates in the proportional elections. These candidates, do they have the right to open up their own election funds? The candidates? No. A fund, they have the right to it. Even those candidates who are on the lists, as inside the list there is also some competition between the candidates. So they are allowed to have their own election funds. In that case, they would open up it separately from the party. They have their own administrators and they're autonomous. Well, I wanted to say another thing. Those candidates who are part of the single multi-mandate list and territorial lists, in this or another way, they still depend on the local party organization. And in fact, the possibility for them to open up their accounts on the local levels, there have been not too many discussions for the local level, but I'm talking about the parliamentary level. We had very hot discussions here to make sure that the candidates who are part of the regional lists at the parliamentary level, you're speaking correctly, we're talking about internal party competition. And this internal party competition may suggest certain results within a constituency. But I wanted to go further on, because here we have yet another serious problem here. Whether the local party organization should be held responsible, according to the law, political parties, for those election fund accounts that would be opened up by all the candidates that it nominates. And there is a problem here, but we'll get there. The last question. No, not the last question. I'm going slightly ahead, perhaps. However, within the context of those models, what the social media people are discussing is, are people correct when they say that candidates to the positions of mayors, they should by all means have their separate election funds and accounts, regardless of being nominated by a local or a regional party organization, but they should have their own autonomous election funds. Well, in this slide, you see the key word is they can have their own election funds. At a certain point in time, the Ukrainian legal procedure said that they even have to do it. And even during the parliamentary election, there was a problem with the CEC as to what they can do to the majoritarian candidates who have not opened up their funds. They even gave them 10 days so that they could launch their funds and accounts. And the CEC thought about it for a long time, but as far as I remember, did not hold anyone liable for it. No, not exactly so. First of all, we didn't think very long. We studied the situation. We sent certain cables to the candidates. According to the election law that we had back in 2019, the CEC had the right to reprimand or to warn the candidates, and we did it. We did not, according to the law, we did not accept their reports. They were received by the district election commissions. However, we studied the situation and we warned or reprimanded those candidates that did not open up their election funds or did it after the 10 days that you just mentioned. It's a question about liability or responsibility. This is what even the participants of the elections do not exactly understand. We have already said that every level of the subjects should have one's own election fund. For example, if there is a list to the city council, should have its own election fund. Regional council, its own election fund. So the first question is, would it be a violation if from the regional fund there are funding the campaigning products of a candidate to the local district council. Yes, it will be a violation. And is that correctly? Do people understand that they would be held liable for it? There is liability envisaged for them. There was a discussion about how it should be qualified, whether this can be interpreted as funding from the sources that are not in the law, for a city list, for example, and whether criminal liability may be there, because Article 159 of the Criminal Code, in fact, speaks about 10 minimum salaries as a threshold. I think so. In fact, this is what I started with the story when I spoke about, maybe it was too theoretical, when I talked about the nature of those 3 blocks of funds that we have in the local election. And this third block, although this is private money of a political party, however, public oversight is still there, and sometimes it is even tougher and stricter than what we have with the funds that are public, the national one, because of its nature. So the law speaks very clearly about only one source to fund the election campaign. This is a candidate's own election fund.
In several discussions, I heard different opinions and ideas as to the use of campaigning products at the level of oblast, if it is produced from the funds meant for oblast council elections. We have to remember that campaigning materials should be funded from the respective fund depending on the elections, and it can be used for any other candidates. If it is oblast council and you fund the leaflets with the names of candidates for city council, and if the person is not the member or is not the candidate for the oblast council, there's going to be a violation. The person can face liability for that. However, another thing to note here is that it's good that the key word in the law is can set up electoral fund, despite the warnings received by the candidates from the single seat constituencies at the parliamentary elections, when they sort of expected a kind of harsher sanctions. At the local elections, in the course of 2-3 years, we witnessed that at the level of the amalgamated community, the candidates often don't open any accounts, in other words, don't set up electoral funds. Why? Because most of them are afraid of doing that, because there is a responsibility or liability for that. Well, they don't want to bear any responsibility, and it's not liability, administrative or criminal, but organizational responsibility is very demanding, and unless you have any accounting skills or financial skills, it's not easy to do it, and that's why people don't want to do this, because they're concerned about responsibility and liability. Another reason for not doing that is that people don't know that they have to. And at the lowest level, on the level of the amalgamated community, that's really concerning. The thing is that even at the national elections, people are afraid and hesitate to do that because the candidates don't have any idea of how to do that, how to fund their campaign. And when we sent cables to the candidates, and that was in the cases when we didn't have any information on their accounts or on their electoral fund, this encouraged them to do something about that, because at a later stage they are supposed to report on that, and in case of failure to do that, they would receive warning as a sanction. As to cross-cutting funding, that's another question that we should discuss. When you produce let's say the poster, when you see the team from this political party, and well, the forefront, you see the candidate for the mayor, on the left that's candidates to the city council, and the other two oblast council. So that means that everybody should take care of his own campaign and funding of his campaign. So what should they do? Have separate funds, or have a merged fund? Okay, so how would you do that? Well, you can merge funds, but at a later stage you might face legal effects, I would say, when it comes to reporting and reflecting this on respective documents. It's not recommended. The only correct way is the one established by law, when campaigning materials are recorded on the respective documents, depending on the type of elections. If the desire of consolidating the efforts is strong, then the only thing that you can have in common, and that is not personalized campaigning materials, though formally it could be a violation. For instance, leaflets that are produced from the Oblast Electoral Fund will support Party A with symbols, logos, and colors, etc. And if it is disseminated on the territory of the same oblast, then indirectly they would encourage to vote for the team of this party at other elections as well. So in theory, if you prove that these leaflets are disseminated by the candidate who conscientiously failed to open his account, or opened an account but doesn't have money on that and uses other funds, then, well, there might be a liability in this instance as well, but it's hard to prove. When you talk about personalized things, I wouldn't recommend doing that. Though in theory, well, you can sort of try and do that. Well, sometimes politicians come up with ideas and say, that's what we are doing, that's what it works, and you lawyers have to take care of the legal side of it. The accounts of electoral fund, I'm not going to speak about them in detail. When we talk about election fund under the proportionate system, there could be two accounts, one accumulation account and one current. Current for ongoing spending, accumulation for savings. Current accounts could be several. They could be open for every constituency, for each type of elections. All these accounts should have administrators. Similarly, the candidates for the leaders and as councillors should have one current account. But it is shown here for everybody to see the scale of this work. So types of elections under proportionate system, we divide or multiply rather by 2, and therefore we'll have a huge number of different accounts, and each of them should have its own administrator. Where do we get these administrators? Administrators are either the candidates, so that's the easiest option, or if there's proportionate system, then these are the designated persons in the single multi-mandate or in the territorial constituency. When it comes to the candidates that open their accounts of fund independently on their own, these are their proxies. And when we talk about the local party organizations in Oblast, that's a large number of people, and their coordinated work is of critical importance, and it is a very important element of the entire election process. Why? Because it's not only accounts, but the costs and their relations between them, I mean administrators of different accounts, and relations between local party organizations and administrator that is subject to different restrictions by law. And these are restrictions not only of the electoral type of nature. When you talk about restrictions that are related to for instance, return of funds. These are left over, so to say, and that's the last day at 6 p.m. before the day of voting. So if that's some money that is left on the account that are not spent, then they should be returned to the local party organization account based on the decision of the respective authority, and that's internal party mechanism that should be resorted to under the statute. I know when some parties had problems with that. When at the beginning of the election campaign, some of the parties made decisions not by a small authority, let's say council or the board or whatever they had, but if it was a Congress or assembly, then they might face some issues. So these restrictions require careful scrutiny, and that's also linked to the reporting. I'm not talking about the reporting, we'll discuss it later, but the D-Day or the important time is October 19. The accumulating account administrators should receive reports from the current accounts administrators, and if that's a final report, that's November 1. The first set was for the interim reports. So all this army of administrators, and I'm flipping through the slides to show the numbers where we need to multiply them with the number of electoral funds, the number of elections. All of them should be in compliance with the time frame, collect all the reports, submit the reports. We have kind of, more flexible legislation here. All the reports should be submitted to TEC that should scrutinize the reports. They actually exercise monitoring of the funds that were received, spent, etc. And this assessment should be conducted within the time frame as defined by the law, and I don't think it's going to be a very detailed analysis, but at the same time, the responsibility of the candidates to submit these reports is there. Let's go to the slide with the army of administrators. Webinars are watched by the participants of the election race, and we have some life hacks that we should provide to the candidates. And the practical question here is, can we have the administrator, the same person that would administer the current account and the accumulating account? Also, it's very important to have different administrators of current and accumulation accounts. Let me explain why. For local party organizations, there is yet another issue. Should they report for the spendings from the electoral funds to an ACP, and would it be just a traditional reporting? If you look at the law on political parties, you can see that contributions to political party electoral fund are also contributions that were made by the candidates at different types of elections. This provision was incorporated into legislation in 2016, and it seems to me that's a black day for the party when it appeared in the law. In December 2019, the parliament amended the law on political parties, polished the law, and thus all requirements to include into the party reports all expenditures were eliminated, but they stayed in the requirements as to the reports to be submitted to an ACP. An ACP believes that the reports should cover this type of course, and most importantly, the contributions to political parties are also contributions to the election fund made, and if it is contribution that is directly linked to this political party. Hopefully, with the time, an ACP will clarify these things. But if you talk about parties, administrators, and about the army of these people, then it is desirable that people that administer party reporting would be part of this process. And that's reporting on for quarters 3 and 4, and that's reporting that is submitted to an ACP. So delineation of powers within the electoral process between administrators of different accounts and financial experts of the local party organization should be clear and well, it's very important to have one person who would be in charge of one issue. You know, it's not easy to find good accountants. You know, it's easy to find one person who would administer both current account and accumulation account, but it's not allowed to do that. Well, you can. The law does not clearly prohibit for one person to administer a current and accumulation account. We did that in 2015, right? We did that at the national elections. We did that at the presidential elections for accumulation and current accounts. Well, we need to look at the possibility of the person to be capable of administering these types of accounts. What happens? Accumulation account is needed to accumulate funds. If a local party organization opens one accumulation account as provided by electoral law and one current account, then, from my perspective, there is no problem for one person to administer both accumulation and current ones. If a local party organization opens several current accounts, then there could be a question whether one person will be able to cope with that. Well, that's one thing, and given that it is one person that would keep an eye on election fund and in making sure that this money is transferred to the current account, then the person would be interested in transferring more funds in his account rather than other accounts. So the party should conduct risk assessment to see what are the advantages and disadvantages of several models. At the national elections, given the fact that the CC is exercising the monitoring over the election funds of the political parties and those who nominated candidates. It's not desirable to have many current accounts. Why? Because it's very difficult to meet time frame as established by the electoral code to make sure that you collect all the necessary information on current accounts, so that at a later stage you would submit the report to the administrator of accumulation account and then to the CC. You can have only one current account that would serve all TSCs. Thank you. Let's move over to the next part then. That's funding. I am not going to cover the things that we discussed. I'll try to focus on some things that are worth noting, just to assist the participants of the election race and TECs. As it was said before, funding of the local elections on October 25 is done by the public funded that is allocated under respective program. Funds are allocated to the TSCs in the form of the subventions, that's local budgets, and funding on the level of the subjects of the electoral process, that's local organizations, political parties, and candidates, and that's done from their own coffers.
Now, as regards the funding of the territorial election commissions, in fact, there is a huge problem as regards the use of this money and the presence of qualified experts to provide the spending of the money allocated to them. So for the TEC, what is important is to choose the right persons to engage, who would have the experience of working in the budget sector, because they're using the money that comes from the budget, from the national budget. They would have certain experience of organizing processes related to the treasury, to the use of the law on public procurement, etc. Because at that stage, where the commissions try to organize their work, it is very important to take care of all the organizational aspects. We see that the TECs, that according to the election code and the previous law on the local elections, are permanent legal persons, they, in order to provide proper preparation for the local election on the 25th of October, they were supposed to be registered as legal persons. All the other commissions that were there, the TECs that were set up for the election of 2015, they have to be terminated as legal persons. And there are very many factors that have affected the organization of the process of registration of legal persons. The fact that the state register has been updated, the territorial structure has changed, and the fact that the formation of the territorial commissions is no longer part of the election process, while the other parts of the election code have not been amended, has also had some negative impact upon the processes. For example, the election commissions should have opened up their treasury accounts, the special accounts, in order to start those accounts, in order to be able to make sure that the local party organizations, the candidates, could put the money in those accounts. First, they were supposed to get registered as legal persons. And the registration problems, well, are there because the Treasury would not open up their accounts then. So it's a complicated election campaign. We have seen it since the very beginning. At the same time, we try to encourage them somehow to support the TECs with all the necessary materials, to give them certain assistance, including as regards registration and opening their accounts, and further on as regards the use of the money that they would get. Now, as to the money in the election funds, we've said it already that, first of all, an election fund is a certain object that means that certain steps are to be taken by the local political party organizations and candidates in order to fund their election campaigns, including the campaigning events. Basically, that's the only lawful source that allows them to provide funds for it. At the same time, the code says that the election funds can be established if a local party organization and a candidate carry out campaigning by meeting voters, and they're meeting them out there in the open air because then they would not have to pay for renting the premises. They may work without launching their election funds. However, if a local party organization or a candidate plan to fund their campaigning activities, then of course, to make sure that they have legal funding, they should set up their election funds. A novelty here in the election code is that the money in the election funds can be used not only to finance campaigning activities, but also to fund the campaign as such by the local party organizations and the candidates, including to fund campaigning activities. And here we have two questions as regards funding and a possibility to open up or not to open up election funds. The election code says that the citizens of Ukraine have the right to freely discuss programs of the candidates, participants of the elections. Does a person have the right to spend the money in this process? Well, in view of what we have just discussed, we said that the objective of the election fund is to fund the campaigning activities by the local party organizations or candidates. If a physical person, a Ukrainian citizen, wants to campaign for any subject, they have the right to do it. But in this situation, the initiative should come from that physical person rather than from a local party organization or a candidate. Because if the initiative for this campaigning is the local party organization or a candidate, they would have to make sure that these activities are funded from their election, with their election funds. Well, it's important to add, it says an initiative of a local party organization can be carried out by local citizens. However, if this is campaigning made by one's own initiative, I want to remind you that there is Article of the Code on Administrative Offenses says that there is liability for violating the campaigning procedures. So the campaigning procedure is clearly established in the law, and it says campaigning materials should be financed with money from the election fund. So such a voter can be held liable. Talking about some more trite situations where during such a rally, open air rally, a voter has brought up some, water for the participants to drink. Or when we're not talking about campaigning as such or campaigning materials, and there are no elements showing that there is a voter buyout, then such an initiative is probably possible. But we cannot say that that's a kind of a good kind of behavior. If a voter wants to support somebody, one can contribute to one's election fund to comply with the law, all of its standards. While talking about the water, water, and bringing water and offering it to other people to drink can carry the elements of bribery. But if I understand it correctly, a citizen cannot just finance campaigning, but can make a contribution to the election fund, or express one's ideas in the social media or in some other way without spending money. Yes. Another question, a controversial one. We've discussed it at the previous webinars. The previous CEC, even issued some comments about that. That's a possibility to fund from the election funds of the activities of the people who are directly involved in campaigning, who are working in the tents, who give out the leaflets, or participate actively in the campaigning in some way. Last year, the CEC once provided its comments saying that according to the law on voluntaries, their costs can be compensated. The costs for communication, transportation, and other things to be found in that law. And the CEC was immediately criticized. Some people said that that was legalizing bribery, in fact. And the question is, what is the situation today? As far as I know, many participants of the elections are just afraid of somehow documenting such costs from the election funds, so they would not be interpreted as bribery. We have studied the reports during the election campaign of 2019. We did not see in those reports any situation where compensation would be provided to the physical persons who participated in campaigning. But talking about paying for the work of a physical person, this is impossible to provide this pay from the election fund directly, because in that situation we have to look at the tax laws, taxation of the income. The election fund is a temporary object. It's not a business. It cannot be registered, for example, as a tax agent. So as regarding pay according to contracts that could be concluded with physical persons, but in practice it would be impossible to do it today. The CEC in its comments suggested that it would be possible to compensate for other costs of a physical person related to business trips, transportation, accommodation, etc. This can be done. But again, in this situation, one has to study the situation from every angle, including as regards voter buyout. But I think a very important element of the election code is that it is possible to make one's costs legal and lawful, the costs of the election headquarters, because it says that the election funds can be used to procure certain material values or to pay for certain services, etc. As the situation is today, a draft blank of the reports has already been developed, the reports that are to be submitted during the election fund by the administrators of the election funds, of the local party organizations and of the candidates. And we believe that in those formats there are two important things related to the campaign: a possibility to buy material values and to pay for certain services, like renting, for example, facilities where the headquarters of a local political party would be located. That's already a breakthrough to legalize the costs of those organizations, because we understand that the costs are there, but it is paid from some unknown sources. It is not public because the information about these costs is not made public. Well, the question is there because the participants of the elections would perhaps be ready to work transparently, but they face more risks rather than benefits as a result of this legalization. Of course, so in that situation, one should use the money according to the law, and have a very balancing approach while documenting the costs. Because sometimes there can be situation, for example, when in fact they're using the money the way they should, but it has been documented in such a way that the objective of this payment allows for a different interpretation. But the interim and the final reports are to be made public. That's why I'm calling upon all the subjects of the election process that would work with the election funds to be very careful when approaching issues related to documentation. Because earlier, only the accumulated reports, the total reports, were to be made public. Today, they have to be broken down into all the lines, all the elements, so that everyone can study every position, every line related to the use of the funds. Breaking down, you mean what we call the primary reports? This is the primary kind of information, original information that can be found in the checks, in the calculations, but it has just been brought together by the fund administrators into the general tables, so that one can see how much money has been paid to whom. Yes, it's another novelty. The CEC, have you already developed, have you developed this codification of possible payments? Well, let me clarify one thing about codification. At the national level elections, we already know that every position related to the use of the election funds has certain codes, certain numbers. That's because the national campaigns, the CEC becomes a part of the email system of the National Bank. And in order for us to be able to get quickly information, and with the structure that we need for our analysis, that's what the codes are for. Now, as regards the local election, first of all, oversight is carried out by the TECs, which unfortunately, or maybe it's even a better thing, they are not part of the National Bank's email system. So they would not get this quick information that the CEC has during the national elections. And basically their oversight would more deal with such issues, for example, when they get information from a bank about an account that has been opened up, they would deal with the issues about whether it has been opened up correctly, whether an administrator has been appointed, and they would further exercise this oversight by analyzing the report, because the TECs, according to the code, will not get this information from the banks as regards the cash flow in the accounts. On the other hand, well, this is negative, but on the other hand, we see how those the DECs and territorial election commissions during the local elections, we will see how they work with information. So there is a kind of a reservation because they can disseminate personal data of certain physical persons who would make contributions, and this information should not be made public without their consent. So the analysis would be the analysis of those financial reports that would be submitted before the election day and after the voting day. We discussed it at the previous webinars. Whether the DECs have proper expertise, and from your experience of previous election campaigns, whether they would really study those documents, because we can expect there are going to be very many subjects. For example, many regions, there can be 30 to 40, 50 participants or parties that would compete for the local councils, regional councils. So that would be like 40 reports. Once again, we're talking about the lack of well-qualified experts who would really do this analysis. On the other hand, studying financial reports does not really require any additional knowledge like accounting or bookkeeping, because according to the report, everything should be clear and visible, because you would have separate lines for every payment that would then be aggregated into the overall report form, and to analyze whether these reports comply with the law would just give one a general understanding of how these election funds are formed. And as regards the use of the funds, well, one should understand what exactly this money can be used for and study that. Yes, we have some concerns because there may not have serious approaches to this issue, because as we see from the practice of the national elections, when the DECs would study the financial reports provided by the candidates' administrators in the single mandate constituencies, so that analysis was very formalistic to fill in a certain form established by the CEC, just to have something, right? Yes, what would you say?
There are two important elements, and the first is much more of a philosophical, global nature. That's about the effects of this analysis, whether this could be decisive for the future of the candidate, because any other means are not likely to be effective. Revoking registration for the wrong report or wrong campaigning is unproportionate, and we know this from the experience. That was a negative experience, so this effect cannot be there. Other type of effects are in the form of warning or expressing concerns, etc. Formally, when it comes to the legal aspect of it, I don't think the candidates would be kind of, concerned about that. There could be one other option, and it's not so much about the forms established by the CC, but the things that would be part of the electoral code, and that's informing voters about this. So in other words, the voters should be aware, and that's basically the idea of the interim report. So it's publicized, we had a slide about that, it's publicized on October 19th, so very soon, before the elections. You're talking about political responsibility. No, not only. I'm talking about political as well as responsibility in the election process, because political responsibility, that's supporting or not supporting some position, but in the latter case, that's the civic control. And then it's not only the TECs that can quickly scrutinize these reports, but the voters themselves, as well as large public, can know better what happened. And the form of reporting or informing the voters about that is in need of finalizing or improving, because at the moment we have financial reporting, and it's not easy to handle this even by professionals. So we need to do something about that. The stronger financial reporting monitoring is, the stronger the reverse effects are. And we spoke about that. The candidates are reluctant to open their accounts, not to report on that. We spoke about that, but that's a visualization. The CEC received numerous requests as to the requirements to open election funds at different levels. Election fund is not just an account that you open. Some ask about, how many accounts are needed and should I? To have election fund, you need to consider several issues. The first, that's administrator or administrators opening an account or accounts, the use or appropriation of the election funds, interim and final reporting, and based on the election campaign, you close the account. So as to administrators of the election funds, let me just add one other thing. If you look at the subjects that exercise monitoring over the election funds, Then we talk about the authorities, state authorities, territorial election commissions. We are talking about the banks. From my perspective, an important thing here is internal monitoring, because if the work is properly organized at this level and you exercise ongoing internal control on the part of the administrator of the election fund, this would contribute to eliminating any violations. And if the voters let's say, receive or get access to interim report, then they will understand that, okay, so that was well-organized campaign, and they might support these subjects. So what I'm saying is that internal control is of primary importance. One concern as to the administrator of the accumulation account to be appointed as among the candidates. Well, there is some kind of a competition among candidates, so that would mean that some candidates would receive some advantages and more money would be transferred to the account of a certain candidate, etc. So in this case, then, when it comes to appointment of the administrator of the accounts of the election fund, you have to be really well-reasoned. I'm talking about the party and candidates who should take really very reasonable decision. As to the procedure for opening accounts of the election fund, as of today, we keep receiving oral requests claiming that there are some obstacles created by the banks when it comes to opening accounts. The experience of 2019 proved that some of the banks are not ready to open accounts. Opening and closing accounts of the election funds is a transaction that banks conduct only during the election process. That's something that doesn't bring any money to the bank. That's why some banks refuse to open these accounts, and we can't do anything about that. What about the National Bank? As to the National Bank, well, it does govern the operational activity of the commercial banks, but the National Bank cannot force them into some action. So we request the National Bank to inform the banks of Ukraine that we are launching election campaign and the election funds are going to open their accounts, etc. So one other thing, and that's a new thing, that if previously, for instance, the procedure of opening and closing accounts of the election funds was part of the standard procedure that was issued by the National Bank, and that was typical of opening and closing any accounts. At the moment, to meet requirements of the election code, we adopted and it was approved by the NBU jointly with the EC, the procedure which is different for opening accounts of the election funds, opening and closing these accounts. Documents, the list of the documents necessary is not anything special. The most important thing is that the subjects of the election process should have clear idea what they should do, and the bank should be responsive when it comes to opening election fund accounts. From what I know, the banks might have an issue that is linked to territorial restrictions. In some regions, there could be a limited number of branches, and well, there are not so many banks that are operating in some areas. Well, exactly, especially in the villages. Well, I think that in every village there should be some kind of a branch, if not a full branch, but some branch of the bank. But, well, you have to know the legislation. Opening election fund account is not an everyday operation that bank conducts, and that's one of the reasons on the part of the bank to refuse opening the accounts. Election fund composition. Well, there is a difference between the election funds of the party organization that nominated the list, the election fund of the candidates that are nominated by the organization of the party and the candidates that are self-nominated. The specificity here is that one of the sources, if it is a nomination made by the political party, and we are talking about the party list and the candidates, then this party can fund the events of election campaign and campaign materials. We have legislative restrictions as to the voluntary contributions of physical persons. If you compare this with the election fund at the national elections, then if in that case, it's established by the law and political parties, and the list of the subjects that are entitled to make contributions to election fund is really wide. So it covers contributions of legal entities in particular. If you talk about local elections, then voluntary contributions can be made only by physical persons, and we have the ceiling to one election fund that shouldn't exceed 10 minimum salaries, 50,000 hryvnia made to one election fund. It can be made not necessarily within one payment, so it could be several payments. The most important thing is that the total sum should exceed 50K. Well, 1 and 2 are clear to me. Why can't you make contributions by legal entities? Why? I think you should ask lawmakers. I can't answer that question. Legal entities can make contributions to the party coffer, and it can fund local organizations. Why would you impose the restriction that makes legal entities to go an extra mile and do that via political parties? Just to have better understanding what kind of legal entity it is, because if it is the money credited to the account of local party organization, then it would be 100% guarantee that this legal entity is going to be covered by the report submitted to an ECP, and the monitoring of the contributions there is much higher than in the election funds. At the recent parliamentary elections, we had a popular practice when contributions were made by NGOs. And statutory organization of the NGO provides for this right of the NGOs, and that was kind of marginal when it comes to financial monitoring. Well, it depends on the specific situation. Sometimes it was a kind of an artificially created organization that by statute included some specific activity to be able to do that. But when it comes to the national public officials, whether that's their accounts or payments, very often banks resort to the full inspection that's under the financial monitoring procedure. And it's not about election funds, but local organizations rather. And I know two instances. To pay a deposit, you need to have an account. And they had issues with the bank because the banks launch 2 or 3 week procedure of financial monitoring of some officials, and this might happen to the election funds because mandatory thing is identification. It depends on the sum of the contribution and the fund, and you have to consider that. When it comes to the public officials, the banks enjoy some discretion to impose their own restrictions with respect to PEPs, and that's exactly what they do to avoid liability, because that's really harsh for them. So they resort to the use of banking legal framework, and we can't avoid that. So we do have the instances of PEPs being subject to inspection and that delays opening the accounts and transfer of the money to the election fund, etc. In 2019, during the elections then, we worked with the National Bank of Ukraine and talked to the major banks where the accounts were opened to explain the procedures to them and to the administrators to warn them about potential issues. On the other hand, we requested the NBU and commercial banks to reduce the period of time because election process is limited time-wise and you can't extend the period of time more than it is determined by the election legislation.
As to the use of the election fund, we've already discussed it today that there are certain restrictions. For example, the money from the election fund must be used to fund the election campaign, including campaigning as such, so they have a certain target. Their own election campaigns, right? Because we've talked about cross-funding, and this cross word has many legal consequences. As we talk to many political parties that turn to us with requests, for example, as regards opening up election funds at different levels, when you tell them that in this situation they have to analyze all the section of the election code dealing with the election funds, because it can ensue the issues of election funds to be opened up in certain constituencies, appointing administrators. Everything is interrelated. The money is only used in cashless form. They are allowed to pay only for the services according to the invoices that were concluded before the Wednesday previous to the voting day, etc. Now, as regards the interim and the final financial reports, there is a mechanism for submitting the interim report so that people and the voters could consciously choose a certain candidate or a local party to vote for, so that they could see before the voting day the situation as regards the election fund, how it was used, and the final financial report is to be submitted after the voting day to the relevant territorial election commission that would further study both the interim and the final report. The accounts are to be closed by the banks before that day. The decision should be made to send the money back to the local political party organization's account. Now, as regards publicizing or publishing the financial reports submitted to the TECs, they have to be made published. They have to be made public by the TEC within 2 days after receiving it. It is published on the official website if it has it, and the websites of the local councils if they have it, and if there are territorial regional offices, they should be published at their websites, or in another way is established by the Commission. Usually this is done by publishing those reports, also placing them on the information stands. Besides, a novelty in the election code is that the party organizations that have nominated their candidate lists and have their own election funds, they have to publish their interim and final reports at the official websites of the party organization, if any, or in another format online within 2 days after they receive them. I believe that this is a real mechanism that would allow these reports to become public, as they have to be made public in the websites. Because if we look at the previous situation where those processes were to be carried out by the DECs, and if they decide that it should be just the information stands, so the information stands somewhere in an obsolete corner in a building with no access or with hardly much access, and it would not be real to analyze those reports then without having an electronic version of it or a paper version. I would also like to say that in 2019 the CEC published financial reports both of the presidential candidates and the ones submitted during the parliamentary election, not only in the PDF format but as an open data. And I think that this is a step ahead to make sure that certain subjects are informed if they're interested in studying the reports. I've already said that overseeing the functioning of the election funds is to be carried out by the relevant TECs, and the election code says that this can be sporadic control. The absence of current information about the cash flows in the election fund accounts would not allow the election commissions to carry out current oversight. And basically it comes down to getting the reports from the administrators of the election funds. They would study those reports rather. What if someone sends a complaint? Can they respond? Can they react? Well, they can send a request to the administrator. The problem is that, for example, sending a request to a bank, the TEC cannot do that. Because according to the law that regulates banking activities, the information related to the cash flow in any account is the information that only the owner of the account manages, and without the owner's consent, this information cannot be shared with other persons. Another situation is related to the national election, where the election law and the banking law suggest that information from the election funds should be provided to the territorial or to the local commissions. Well, there is less control, less oversight in case of the local election, right? Maybe. Well, if the TEC has studied financial reports and it sees that there are some elements of the violation of the law, it should inform the authorized bodies that are to hold those persons liable. This oversight can not only be done by those authorities, by the banks as well. They have to perform oversight of all the documents that would allow one to open up certain accounts. They should also oversee the termination of the transactions in the current accounts, and they have to make sure that the transactions are carried out on a timely basis to return the money that has not been used. The banks through which money is transferred to the election funds, they should also study the papers that are submitted by physical persons to carry out those transfers to make sure that they comply with the election code, and they should also study the information that is mentioned in the payment slips while the transfer is made.
Thank you very much, Natalia, for your very interesting presentation. Dear audience, you have a chance to ask questions. We have several minutes left. I have a question on the reporting. Well, yeah, And we had a discussion on that. What's your opinion on this? These dramatic changes that we saw in the election legislation happening in the course of recent couple of months saw an ACP being part of the process or then removed from it, and we have Article 19 or 20 where an ACP is mentioned again as the agency that would exercise the financial reporting monitoring. So, is it going to be an agency who would do that? And what does an ACP think about that? Maybe you know this, either you or Volodymyr. I think that formally under the election code, this provision has been eliminated given the specificity of local elections. It's hard to say whether that's for good or for worse, because an ACP cannot go with analysis of the asset declarations. These are different departments that are in charge of that. But institutional capacity, that's what I mean. Access to information, even in open sources, access to registers, whether that's the department in charge of asset declarations, assessment, or political party funding. I mean, complexity is there, but well, at these elections, even legislative tools wouldn't provide for the efficiency that is expected by large public. At least at the previous elections, it was not effective. That's just my opinion. Whether an ACP is going to be part of the monitoring process, well, I was trying to say that as of today, well, it has not been finally decided yet, and it seems to me that unless the issue is governed by law and if large public is not going to encourage for changes, then political parties will have to submit reports, and that's going to be reports on all election funds, and then ACP is going to be part of the process, and they will have a lot of time, more than established by election legislation or election campaign. So let's wait and see what an ACP will say on that. Since there are no questions, let's recap today's webinar. Let me just remind you that it was organized as part of the series of local elections 2020, and it was dedicated to funding of election campaign and reporting. We had a very interesting discussion with lots of complex questions raised, and the answers were provided to those questions, and recommendations were given to the election commissions and to the parties of the election race. Hopefully that would contribute to your confidence and better information awareness about the complex issues of our election legislation. This webinar, similar to the other 6 previous webinars, will be in open access on YouTube channel and the Council of Europe project and Human Rights NGO platform, and you can view it there. And let me just announce the last webinar to be held on Wednesday, and it's going to be dedicated to complaints and protection of the rights during the election process. And apart from the representative of the CSC and Opora representatives, we are going to have the head of the Cassation Court of Ukraine, the president of the High Cassation Court, Mr. Smakovich, who is going to attend it. So let me thank the speakers, Natalia and Vadim. Natalia, deputy head of the secretariat of the CSC, and Vadim Wenger, PhD of law, associate professor of public law, Kyiv Mohyla Academy, for the participation in today's webinar. Today's webinar was organized by the Council of Europe Project Transparency and Inclusivity for honest election practice and Human Rights Platform NGO. See you next time.